Indian social policy. So I'm very happy to expound on things as I go if anything's not clear or I'm assuming. Ordinary workers in India. And the book casts its eye back over the last century to the early decades of the 20th century, the late colonial period, the moment at which India became one of the founding members of the International Labour Organization, which at an international level was doing a lot of pioneering work in terms of thinking about and initiating legislation on forms of social security for industrial workers. And the book picks up the question of what was happening in India from the reasonably early decades of industrial development. What I'm going to talk about today looks particularly at the mid-20th century moment in which some of the architecture of what we know now as a social security regime for the formal sector workforce crystallised. And it crystallised in a way that has important implications for also understanding the structure of the Indian state. And so, one of my other hats is Indian federalism, an interest in Indian federalism, and the two things have really come together in thinking about the origins of social policy in India in mid-20th century. So the two questions that animate the talk today are firstly, why India adopted a new model of federalism that moved away from what has been called a separate spheres approach, which was much more common before the mid-20th century in some of the world's older federal systems, especially those in the United States and Canada, in which a central government and the states had separate sovereign domains of authority, and in which power, for the avoidance of doubt, would lie with the states. India's model of federalism in very important ways moved away from that approach and adopted a centralised model of interdependence between the central government and the states. And this is what today is known as India's model of cooperative federalism. And what I want to suggest in this talk is that important parts of that model of cooperative federalism are very closely were taking place contemporaneously about how the state should regulate the emerging market, and especially how the state at the centre and or provincial levels should tackle the question of interprovincial economic competition, which was fierce in the early 20th century, especially within the textile industry. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And that kind of competition across regions between the old established textile mills, especially centred in Bombay, and newer upcountry mills spread out across the country, created what we might describe as a race to the bottom in conditions for labour, in terms of labour pay, but also working conditions. And these were pretty unlikely circumstances in which to see the emergence by 1948 of an all-India system of social security for industrial labour. So these two questions are interconnected, hence the connection on the history of federalism and of welfare in the talk. What I hope to do today is to offer a different perspective on thinking about the origins of Indian federalism and the shape that Indian federalism takes today, moving beyond what, for very good reasons, has been the traditional focus of much of the literature on federal origins, which is the impact of partition. And most authors ascribe India's peculiarly centralised model of federation to the impact of partition and the desire, particularly on Nehru's part, to avoid exacerbating potential secessionist tendencies that might have torn apart the Indian nation soon after independence. What I'm going to suggest here is that there are other ways in which we might think about the purpose of central power in the Indian constitution that connect to thinking about social and economic policy in this period. And not only do I think I'm offering some new insights onto origins of important parts of Indian federalism, but I'm also moving towards a more fulsome account of the origins of India's welfare regime. And in this paper, I'm particularly looking at the origins of the formal sector welfare regime. In the rest of the book, I look also at the welfare regime for agrarian labour and informal sector labour later on. And the argument that I'm doing here also pushes beyond some of the standard explanations that we see in existing scholarship, which have focused on the moment beyond independence, especially with especially after the onset of India's second five-year plan, when India adopts a model of import substituting industrialisation, which shelters employers to a good extent from international competition. And existing studies would suggest that is the moment at which India was able to adopt a more pro-worker regime of social security for the formal sector, because employers could be, the costs of labour for employers could be increased because of that shielding from international competition over labour costs. So what I'm going to say today will actually suggest that the origins of that, so to speak, pro-worker form of social policy predate the onset of ISI and are situated really in the debates about how to strengthen a sense of national economy in the late colonial period. Most of this work is archival. It's much more historical than work I've been doing recently on the contemporary politics of welfare. So I've done pretty extensive archival research now over 3 or 4 years in major national archives here in India, in some state archives, but also quite a lot of this draws on material that's both in India Office records in the British Library and records of the India Office of the International Labour Organization. So this draws on a range of sources, and I've been on the Leverhulme Fellowship for the last year to actually be able to try and think this through and write. So in a nutshell, what am I going to argue today? The type of cooperative federalism that India adopted in its constitution and which was foreshadowed especially in the 1935 Government of India Act was unique internationally in the mid-20th century. It was unique because it really enshrined a model of interdependence between the central government and provincial governments, now state governments. And it combined that independence with a pretty centre-heavy model of federalism, which you see, of course, reflected in recent shifts in federalism in the last 5-6 years. This unique architecture of cooperative federalism was shaped by debates about how to enhance national coordination of economic and social policy in the context of the integration or an attempt to better integrate India's national market. And it was particularly informed by a desire both on the part of Indian industrialists in some of India's older industrial centres, and particularly in Bombay, interest of Indian industrialists and Indian trade union leaders to seek to guard against the consolidation of what I've described as race to the bottom dynamics in workers' pay and conditions. And this desire to push against a race to the bottom informed both Indian federalism, but also India's emergent welfare regime. I'll talk a bit later about how some of this constitutional design came about, and in important ways found its way into the Government of India Acts, both of 1919 and then of 1935. But these amendments at important stages just before the passage of both the 1919 and the 1935 Act ensured that the central government was able to legislate in the field of social insurance. When I talk about social insurance, I'm talking about things like sickness insurance, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, forms of insurance that help to mitigate against the risks that workers face as a result of their reliance on their wage. So things that disrupt people's working lives and their wage earning capacity. This was an emerging field at the time that both of the Government of India Acts were being drafted in these decades, and pressure, particularly arising from India's role in the International Labour Organization, pushed the colonial government to agree to a central government role. In fact, the early forms of concurrent legislation in the field of social insurance. Despite those constitutional provisions, which become important later on, in the colonial period, the colonial government was very opposed to extending forms of social policy for industrial workers. It argued against the adoption of new ILO legislation on sickness insurance, for instance, arguing, just as it did across other British colonies elsewhere, that industrial labour in colonies was not yet to be seen as a form of settled urban industrial labour force. This was still primarily seasonal workforce that was engaged in circular migration, and workers who were attached to their land and keen to return to that at the end of the day. So this migratory view of labour militated against the introduction of social policy for industrial workers, and the colonial government had no interest in spending anything on this, of course, as well. So we have constitutional provisions that come into play later on, but colonial resistance by and large to extending forms of social insurance for industrial workers. Despite a growing wave of industrial action from around 1919 onwards, and growing incidence of sickness prevalence in industrial centres. And what I'll suggest in this paper was that it was the Second World War that served as a critical juncture, which enabled Indian leaders, and yet not the same Indian leaders who've been engaged in some of these debates in previous decades. And in that sense, the role of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was especially important. Ambedkar took on the role of Minister for Labour. And it was Ambedkar on the Viceroy's Executive Council who pushed forward plans for national social security for industrial workers very vigorously during the Second World War, which laid the groundwork for then what was passed in 1948, just after, less than a year after independence, same time that the Constituent Assembly was deliberating. India had already legislated on sickness insurance for its industrial workforce at a national level. And if you think about, those of you who know a bit about the welfare state, if you think about how difficult it has, for instance, been for the United States to adopt federal legislation on health insurance, you can see that actually what was happening here in India in some ways in the 1940s was pretty astonishing, and it owed very much to Ambedkar's role on the VEC in this period. Why might all of this matter today? Well, one of the reasons I've got into some of these questions, particularly looking at the linkage with this idea of cooperative federalism, is that cooperative federalism is very much back on the agenda today. You hear this government in particular talking about the need to re-imbibe the cooperative spirit of federalism. Narendra Modi, the BJP, came into office on a platform that talked of building a team India, of the central government working together with the states. But the term cooperative federalism is used very loosely, both in political discourse and used often by critics of government, suggests that what's being done is not sufficiently cooperative, and that it has promoted the role of the central government over that of the states. Actually, what I'm going to tell you today is that the type of cooperation that is embedded in Indian federalism is a centre-heavy model. It's one of interdependence, not so much of ensuring that the states have an institutionalised role in national policy making. So it's relevant both because cooperative federalism is back on the agenda, and much of the debate today centres on this question of the relative fiscal space of the central government and state governments, and how that fiscal relationship speaks to the question of what the role of the central government should be in underwriting minimum standards of social protection and public goods provision across the country. That, of course, is one of the central tenets that the Finance Commission uses to think about the pattern of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And as you'll see, these questions resonate with what was being debated in the mid-20th century too. It's also the case that formal sector labour laws are also very much back on the policy agenda, have been really since the onset of economic liberalisation, but in recent years, reforms or the attempts to initiate reforms in this sphere, particularly under the guise of the ease of doing business and improving the ease of doing business here. There's been a big focus on reducing the role of the labour inspector and providing states the space to reform some formal sector labour legislation. Now, the debate isn't typically focused on social security for industrial workers or for formal sector workers. But if we think about the boundaries between the formal and informal sector, the existence of social protection for the formal sector is in fact the way the state itself measures the size of the formal sector. So how is the formal sector usually defined? It's those people who are members of the Employee State Insurance Corporation, ESIC, which is the form of sickness insurance that I was just talking about, introduced in 1948. So these are very important questions around the kind of the boundaries of the formal and informal sector. in India. And of course, some people would argue that it is the strength of labour legislation for the formal sector that accounts for the resilience of the informal sector in India, where, of course, employment rights and social protection are that much weaker. Okay. So to get into some of the theoretical underpinning of the argument I'm making about the relationship between federalism and the welfare state. In some ways, federalism and the welfare state as ideas are in tension with each other. And this quote here from scholars who have worked on federalism and the welfare state in Europe and North America speaks to that. So federalism is a type of political institution that in different ways is designed in order to uphold diversity and to enable, in different measure, degrees of regional autonomy in decision-making and policy implementation. Every federal system looks different in terms of how that kind of diversity is enshrined, but federalism as an idea, and especially if we think about the way that unity and diversity are deployed in the Indian discourse about federalism. Federalism is an institutional device that enables unity to coexist with diversity. And in some ways, that rubs up against the idea of a welfare state, which is typically seen as grounded in a universal conception of social citizenship. So the universalism and the equality of social rights that is intrinsic to a kind of classic idea of a welfare state is, in theory, in tension with federalism as a form of political institution. So for that reason, much of the literature on federalism and welfare states has found that federalism tends to undermine the development of welfare states. And that's for a number of reasons. That's because it disperses power in a way that makes it harder, or the way that weakens the regulatory authority, the regulatory capacity of the central government. Through, to differing extents, levels of decentralisation, federalism enables regional interest groups to block redistributive policies. So many studies have found that both interregional and interpersonal redistribution are lower in federal systems compared to non-federal systems of government. And allied to that idea is that federalism, especially decentralised forms of federalism, are kind of ripe context for the emergence of a race to the bottom in terms of the conditions for workers, because competition over mobile capital, so state governments who are competing to attract investment, will want to keep labour costs low for potential investors. So that's an important part of the internal competitive dynamics that certain types of federal design can produce. So that's the pessimistic account, and I would say in many ways that is the dominant narrative in the literature on federalism and welfare states. There is, however, another strand of literature or some other studies which, while they might recognise some part of this pessimistic picture, also see federalism as a structure which enables decentralised policy innovation and policy experimentation. So by enabling that, by enshrining that model of diversity, allowing regional units, states in India, to define and design their own forms of social policy, federalism enables that kind of policy experimentation. It may enable emulation, so horizontal policy diffusion, and also regional policy experiments can also be picked up centrally and scaled up. And we've seen, plenty of examples of that happening in India. You can take the example of Tamil Nadu's role in introducing midday meals, the kind of reforms that it made to the delivery of the public distribution system, which helped to inform both policy on national midday meals as well as the more recent National Food Security Act. So two competing ideas about federalism and the development of welfare states. Moving, well, and those, in a way, this view of federalism is usually takes for granted a relatively decentralized model of federalism. So to the kind of classic example of the states' rights model in American federalism. But it's important to recognize that both federalism and social policy and welfare policy are dynamic. And social policy itself or demands that the central or that the government gets more involved in social provisioning has at key historical junctures produced important changes in both the functioning of federal systems and the constitutions in some cases of federal systems. And during the Second World War, there was a lot of debate, both in the so-called older federations, and especially in this period in the US and Canada and to some extent in Australia, about the need or desirability of reforming federalism in a way that moved beyond that traditional idea that the central government and the states had separate sovereign spheres of authority, towards a more cooperative model of federalism by which, in different ways, whether through constitutional amendment, which moved, so for instance in Canada in 1944, if I remember right, Canada amends its constitution in order to move jurisdiction over pensions and unemployment insurance to the federal government. That is never possible in the US, but in this period you start to see more discussion of using federal transfers, so often called grants in aid by the American federal government in order to incentivize states to build up, in this period particularly, unemployment insurance. Something that was very difficult to achieve within a more decentralized model of federation because of the competition between states or provinces in Canada and opposition from employers who didn't want to face increases to their own labour costs without changes happening at the national level. So one of the first people to coin the expression cooperative federalism was this chap called A.H. Birch, who was a lecturer at the University of Manchester. And this was a study in 1955 of fiscal federalism and the emerging trends of social security in Canada, the US, and Australia. But Birch also, towards the end of this book, has a concluding chapter which looks at the emerging trends in what were the world's newer post-war federations. And of course, India was the most important example amongst decolonizing nations as a country that was defining a very new form of federalism. And Germany was another example of a post-war Germany, of a new model of what was described then as cooperative federalism. So a form of federalism that moved beyond this idea of independence of each sphere, of each level of government between the federal authorities and regional authorities, towards a principle of cooperation between the centre and the states. And India was probably the first country to adopt this kind of cooperative model of federalism right from the outset. And in important ways, it had already, under the Government of India Act, started to put some of the architecture of a model of cooperative federalism into place. What does that mean in concrete terms? So India's constitution looked unusual at the time because it had a pretty substantial concurrent list. I don't know how many of those. Does everyone know about the concurrent list? Yeah. So the The Constitution divides legislative authority between the Union, the states, and areas which are areas of shared jurisdiction between the centre and the state. Concurrency is an important form of this interdependency. There are also unusual, in comparative terms, mechanisms for the central government to legislate on areas that are in the state list. So the idea that the states have their own separate sovereign sphere of authority comes under some pressure in the Indian Constitution. In very important ways, the centre and states are interdependent in fiscal terms. So the Constitution doesn't allocate sufficient tax-raising capacities to the states to enable them to be able to fulfil those responsibilities that sit in the state list. So without fiscal transfers from the centre, the states can't fulfil their constitutional policy responsibilities. And of course, we have other unusual constitutional articles, both Article 3, which allows the central government to change the boundaries of a state in the Union. Very hard to imagine in a kind of states' rights model of federalism, and the article on president's rule. So all of these things made Indian federalism distinctive. It's why Indian federalism was described in the 1950s as a model of quasi-federalism. You'll often still see this today under the quasi-federal system, and this is why, because it deviated from the separate spheres approach to federalism. So in both constitutional terms and fiscal terms, you have an empowered central government, but albeit a central government that in very important ways is dependent administratively on the states to actually implement policy. So how does all of this relate to welfare state development and the long-term origins of cooperative federalism? I'm now going to read a little bit, I'm afraid, so I'm going to dive more into some of the history here. From the early 1920s, the question as to whether the colonial state or employers had a responsibility to protect industrial workers against the contingencies of sickness, unemployment, and old age arising from reliance on paid employment became increasingly urgent as labour mobilisation began to take shape in India's industrial centres. However, the growing competition between old and newer centres of India's textile industry created an emergent race to the bottom in labour conditions and pay. And this was a particularly inhospitable environment to advance discussions of social insurance, both because of the colonial unwillingness to encourage or finance social policy, as well as interprovincial competition, which undermined the willingness of employers in individual provinces to increase their labour costs by contributing to local forms of social insurance, such as maternity benefits or sickness insurance. This map shows you, just to give you a sense of, when I talk about a race to the bottom and the competition between the older and newer industrial centres, the triangles, if you can see them at the back, are cotton textile mills, and their size the size of the triangle denotes the size of the workforce in these areas. And what you can see, unlike jute, this is jute over here, which is centred in Kolkata, and there are, apart from two very small centres south of the Hooghly in Calcutta, the jute industry is very geographically concentrated. You can see that and this is a map from 1931, that by this point the cotton textile industry is very geographically dispersed. So Bombay remains the largest centre of the textile industry, but all of these small triangles are other emergent centres of upcountry mills, with particularly important centres in newer emerging centres in places like Madras and Coimbatore, in Kanpur, as well as, of course, in other parts of Bombay Presidency, in Ahmedabad, Sholapur, and so on. And in the context of this domestic competition, the old centre of the textile industry in Bombay was under increasing competition, its total workforce was rapidly declining relative to newer centres, and this was, of course, also a centre of great industrial unrest as textile mills within Bombay themselves were engaging in competitive wage cutting and very erratic changes to the workforce. And in this context of rising industrial action, officials in Bombay became increasingly interested in exploring forms of social security for workers. In this period, they were often thinking about sickness insurance and also the question of introducing paid holidays for workers, which sometimes was thought of as an alternative to paid sickness leave. The presidency government in Bombay was particularly influenced by developments at the International Labour Organization, which, of course, India had become a permanent member of the International Labour Organization in 1919. And India's involvement in the International Labour Organization had really given a fillip both to a national voice for emergent trade unions in India, but also to employers. And in this context, pockets of official thinking began to see sickness insurance and paid holidays as the kinds of policies that might help to stabilise the workforce and improve productivity in Bombay's mills by reducing circular migration, which was often attributed to sickness-related absence. And also, sickness insurance would, in theory, help to subsidise wages in a situation of competitive wage cutting. And all of this was happening simultaneously with the constitutional reforms of this era, which happened simultaneously with India's entrance to the ILO. So these constitutional reforms, the Government of India Act of 1919, enhanced the ability of provincial governments to start to act and design policy in the field of social policy. There was the 1919 Government of India Act, not terribly popular or successful as a form of dividing areas of governmental authority, but it was significant in that it, for the first time, delineated a field of central and provincial spheres of legislative authority. And the subject of labour welfare, the subject that would enable these forms of social insurance, was one of the first examples of a form of concurrent power, which both enabled provinces to legislate with the consent of the Governor-General, but also left scope for India-wide, all-India legislation. And the colonial state only agreed to shift labour welfare from being a purely provincial matter into a concurrent matter in response to feedback from its delegates at the first International Labour Conference in Washington, who argued that the original proposals to provincialise social security legislation would have prevented the central government from undertaking any all-India legislation on the subjects that were being debated at the ILO. But as I've said earlier, despite this potential for central legislation, we don't see much action at the all-India level. What we do see, though, for the first time in 1929 in Bombay is the introduction of the first form of social insurance at a provincial level. And interestingly, maternity benefits are the first form of social insurance. But this move to introduce maternity benefits was fiercely opposed by local textile mill owners in Bombay, who argued not only that maternity benefits were completely premature and unsuited to the conditions of the industrial workforce in India, but also, importantly for this story, that if employers were to bear the burden of paying maternity benefits, that legislation should apply to the whole of India. And a handful of other provinces went on to enact maternity benefits after this and evoked similar notes of dissent among local employers. So this is a quote from Sarabji Mehta, manager of a big textile mill in Nagpur, pushing, not in theory against the idea of maternity benefits or social security for the industrial workforce, but arguing that the legislation must be taken ahead at the all India level, not at the provincial level. And employers in these provinces that were at the kind of the leading edge of starting to introduce social insurance at the provincial level were concerned not only about competition from other British provinces where provincial governments were less inclined towards this kind of legislation, but also from princely states where a lot of these new up-country mills were based as well. So this kind of uneven provincial experimentation, and here we have an example of federalism serving as, or kind of emergent forms of federalism enabling this kind of subnational experimentation. But this uneven provincial experimentation motivated employers to oppose any further attempts to introduce social insurance, especially moves to try and take forward a debate about sickness insurance, which had been highlighted as a pressing concern by the Royal Commission on Labour in India in its 1931 report. That report was important for all sorts of reasons. The Royal Commission report was one of the first times that representatives of moderate trade unions were brought together with employers and the state to try and craft a coherent policy towards labour in recognition of the growing industrial unrest. And it was the first statutory report which asked the colonial government to take forward initiatives on sickness insurance, and it didn't. The colonial government did its absolute best to drag its feet and not take this forward through the 1930s. But it was an important moment in the debate here. And the Royal Commission itself weighed into the constitutional debates that were happening at the same time. The Royal Commission was deliberating at the same time as the Round Table conferences in London, and had a whole chapter on constitutional aspects with regard to labour policy. It argued very strongly in favour of keeping labour legislation in the hands of a central legislature, because without uniformity, sound legislation is extremely difficult to secure. And the Commission likened the kinds of coordination problems that India would see if labour legislation was completely provincialised to those problems that the International Labour Organization had been established to resolve at a global scale. So central coordination of labour policy was important in order to coordinate nationally, just as the ILO was essential to try and advance an agenda for welfare states despite international competition over labour costs. And the round Table Conference delegates in London were also receiving similar advice from the ILO's legal section in Geneva. In fact, the ILO pushed further, saying that if labour legislation were entirely provincialised, the stimulus of international conventions on India would be lost because the central government wouldn't be able to ratify treaty conventions. And that if this were the case, then there may also be ramifications on the willingness of other Asian countries to adopt social insurance. Countries such as China and Japan, also important players in the global textile trade, might be discouraged from taking forward social insurance there if India lacked the central capacity to advance social insurance at home. So there were strong voices favouring a more centralised model of social policy in the 1930s. Despite this, the colonial government did its level best to wash its hands of responsibility for social policy. So when the Government of India Act 1935 was published, the first draft of that moved labour welfare back down to the provincial level. So I think this revealed pretty strongly that the preference of the colonial government was not to increase central responsibility for labour legislation. However, the intervention of Labour Party members led by Clement Attlee, the future British Prime Minister, Labour Party members of the Joint Select Committee, pushed an amendment to the Government of India Act, which advanced arguments that were being made in India by the National Trade Union Federation, who seriously objected to allocating subjects like health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions to the provincial list. And they argued that these policy areas should be included in the concurrent list, while also keeping open the possibility of all India legislation. And that was what was enshrined finally in the 1935 Act. And I would suggest that those debates, which really crystallised around the 1935 Government of India Act, put in place some of the unique features of the cooperative model of federalism that India adopted then formally after independence in its constitution. Yet, even though in 1935 we then have the begrudging colonial acceptance of this need for central legislative authority in this sphere, the political and economic conditions of the late colonial period militated pretty fiercely against any further central action in the field of social policy. Colonial government used the excuse that employers at the provincial level were completely opposed to the idea of sickness insurance, and also the fact of the growing nationalist movement and the newly elected provincial assemblies under the Government of India Act as reasons for the central government not to act. So in effect, 1935 Government of India Act led to a more decentralised approach to social policy, even though the constitutionally it would be possible for the central government to take a stronger position. In this context, the risks of a race to the bottom in workers' pay and conditions became increasingly apparent, both to nationalist politicians, especially in the Indian National Congress, but also to the emerging national organisation of employers, such as the All India Organisation of Employers. And as the final section of the paper will look at, it was during then the critical juncture of World War II that Indian politicians and national employers' organisations called on the colonial government to enhance the national coordination of industrial relations in order to seek to avoid this kind of race to the bottom in industrial competition. And Indian leaders then pushed ahead a pretty firm agenda for social insurance for industrial workers that focused initially on sickness insurance. Kirti, how much time do I have left? Probably got 5-10 minutes here. Am I right? Yeah? So, moving forward into those heady years of World War II. World War II, and in particular the year 1942, in which the Eastern Front of the war opened up, were years of great uncertainty in which the future of India as both a polity and an economy was wide open. Wartime exigencies and rumours shook the state and society, while major political realignments, both within India and in Britain, created a great sense of fluidity. As the historian Indiva Kamtekkar's work has shown, the colonial state appeared increasingly jumpy and unpredictable as India became a central theatre of the Allied war effort following the Japanese defeat of the British in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, and so on, between December 1941 and March 1942. And the threat of a potential brutal Japanese invasion of India aligned the interests of all social strata, from industrialist workers to peasants, inducing what Kamtekar describes as a unity that nationalism frequently claimed but never previously achieved. The war also produced political realignments in India and Britain. In India, of course, those newly elected provincial assemblies resigned pretty soon after they'd been elected in October 1939 in opposition to India's inclusion in the war. Most of the Congress Party's senior leadership were arrested and imprisoned in the latter half of the war after the launch of the Quit India movement in August 1942. This situation was particularly important because it was this shift, this intensification of the nationalist movement that led the British to create more opportunities for Indian politicians to sit on the Viceroy's Executive Council. And particularly important for this story, this is the exact moment when Ambedkar joins the Viceroy's Executive Council as Minister for Labour. And in fact, the position of the Minister for Labour is created at that point. It's set in order to expand the Viceroy's Executive Council. The ministry of the person who held the post of Industries and Labour was separated into Industries and Labour. So for the first moment, you have a representative for Labour on the Viceroy's Executive Council, and that person, for important reasons, happens to be Dr. Ambedkar. And this, I have been very struck by how little has been written about Ambedkar's role in these debates about social and labour policy during the war. I've struggled to find very much at all previously written on this. Importantly for the story of social policy, the war also, and this is a kind of classic critical juncture moment, all forms of political alignment thrown up in the air, the war changed the position of the communists in important ways as well. Previously subject to very severe repression of communist-led labour movements. But after the German attack on the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of India changed its stance on the war, leading it to support the war. This led to a lifting of the official ban on the activities of the Communist Party of India, and the government of India very rapidly shifted from repressing the Communist Party to an attempt to use communist influence to placate restive industrial labour. And there's some really interesting stuff in the archives on attempts to try and use Russian influence to pacify industrial labour in India in this period. And all of those possibilities are opened up by these shifts in the position of the communists within India. And in Britain, of course, things are changing too. The Labour Party, already important in those debates in the Government of India Act, also gained influence on policy towards India in Churchill's War Cabinet. Very soon after the mass arrest of the Congress Working Committee in August 1942, the War Cabinet, led by a couple of Labour ministers, Stafford Cripps, Cripps, most known for the Cripps mission, but also became very interested in this period, 1942, in trying to push a more progressive social policy for India in order to undercut the support or undercut opposition to the war. So the War Cabinet passed a resolution in late 1942, calling for urgent attention for the development of a more progressive social industrial policy. Of course, this is also the period of the declaration of the Atlantic Charter by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, and in Britain, it's the year in which the Beveridge Report for social insurance was published, which paved the way for was one of the key founding stones of the mid-20th century welfare state in Britain. So in all sorts of ways, the legitimacy of demands inside India for social security, for industrial labour, was bolstered by this new global climate of debate about the social and economic obligations that states would face after the war, and also the preparations for now what was agreed would be India's future independence from colonial rule. And it was against that backdrop that national representatives of Indian labour and capital started to push the colonial state to advance a national framework for economic and social policy. That's stuff from the Royal Commission on Labour. We'll skip over that. This is the first meeting of what is now a standing national labour conference, on a tripartite basis. But the first time that a national conference of labour ministers was convened was during the war in 1940. And by 1942, this had become a tripartite body that brought together national representatives of Indian labour, Indian employers, and the state to start to look at the provision of a regulatory framework for industrial relations. And it was also this body which became the key player in pushing ahead the architecture of a national model of sickness insurance initially, but also debating the potential for other forms, more fulsome forms of social security during the war years. You can see that Ramaswamy Mudalia, in opening the first of these national conferences, was very clear about its purpose, and also the fact that the government of India was being called upon not only by industrialists, but there are parallel debates also within the Indian National Congress around the need for a coordinated industrial policy across Congress-ruled provinces before the war. So an attempt to try and move beyond uncoordinated labour laws, inequality of conditions of labour in different provinces of India, and to coordinate labour legislation. And he also likened the role of this National Labour Conference to the kind of role that the International Labour Organization was playing on the international stage. He argued that a coordinated advance in labour matters would further that consolidation of India into a cohesive economic unit, which is as much our goal as its consolidation into one social or political unit. So these debates really fused with the idea of the integration of a national Indian economy. All of this comes to a head just after Congress passed the Quit India resolution. The first tripartite version of the National Labour Conference is held the same day or the day before the passage of the Quit India resolution, and convened by Ambedkar for the first time. Ambedkar described it and its significance as an initiative that was taking place during days of grave emergency. Ambedkar pushed for the tripartite conference to be different from previous conferences. It would be a permanent body, including representatives of employers and employees. It could be called into action when it was needed. It would promote uniformity in labour legislation, but also, and this is put on its agenda for the first time in that meeting in 1942, it would be the forum to discuss all matters of all India importance between labour and capital, and importantly labour welfare and the maintenance of labour morale, which were seen, or Ambedkar saw at that moment, as being highest in importance, especially at this crucial point during the war. So Ambedkar, who had been very opposed to Congress's Quit India movement, he described it as irresponsible and insane, used his new position on the Viceroy's Executive Council to push ahead this development of a national system of social security within a structure of tripartism. He commissioned a lengthy report on health insurance in March 1943, the Ardaka report, and that report became the basis on which legislation for compulsory national sickness insurance for industrial workers that would be financed by contributions from employers and employees was drawn up. By the end of the war, national organisations of both employers and trade unions had accepted the need for such a national scheme, and the Executive Council gave its own approval in March 1946. So when Congress formed the first interim government of India after the war, they very quickly produced a draft bill on sickness insurance, even before independence, which was finally enacted in April 1948, just after independence and while the Constituent Assembly was still debating the Constitution. That, to me, is important. There's another kind of story about how this sits alongside then what happens in the Constituent Assembly, where social and economic rights are relegated to the directive principles of the Constitution. At just that moment that social and economic rights seem to be downgraded, the status of those seems to be downgraded in the constitutional debates, the Constituent Assembly, sitting as the Legislative Assembly, was legislating on the first form of social rights for industrial workers, not universal rights, but for a section of the workforce. And that is striking, I think. So I'll wrap up now. As you've heard, I have argued here that the origins of India's labour welfare regime and those parts of it today which govern the social provision for formal sector workers lie in attempts to strengthen a sense of national economy and to regulate interprovincial industrial competition in the late colonial period. All of this happens against the backdrop of growing international debates about social policy, which crystallised during the Second World War. I would argue that both the shape of India's cooperative federalism, as we know it today, and its early approach to social policy were the product of these constitutional and economic developments of the late colonial period. There are, however, looking at this from the vantage point of today, many things that one might say. Certainly, the idea that the design of a constitution and of those first social policies, the idea that these would encourage national uniformity and reduce inequality across regions hasn't been borne out. The story since independence, and especially since liberalisation, of course, has been one of increasing regional inequality. So cooperative federalism might not have served the goals it was intended to. It's also the case, if we're thinking about how India's welfare regime or its welfare state has developed, that unlike the expectations of some of the actors involved in these debates in the mid-20th century, industrial development did not proceed in a way that enabled mass employment to become the vehicle for social inclusion. So India has not expanded an employment-linked model of social insurance in the fashion that might have been envisaged in the mid-20th century. And that owes a lot to the way that the subsequent five-year plans unfolded in the 1950s. Instead, what we've seen is the emergence and consolidation of a large informal sector, which has much weaker employment rights and much weaker forms of social protection. So today, many of the problems which animated the design of social policy and federalism in India remain very pressing questions. And I will leave off there.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating talk. So many points that you raised, also with respect to Ambedkar. Yeah? There are so many things which he did in the 1940s which haven't made it to the forefront of scholarship yet. I remember I once met a PhD scholar from Chicago who worked on his work as a lawyer at the Supreme Court, and he was surprisingly pro-contract, sort of the emerging work that that PhD student was doing. And so I find it fascinating that somebody like Ambedkar follows the design of a welfare state that is so much entrenched in the formal sector. Yeah? And so it would be my first big question. It seems absolutely plausible that end of the 19th, first half of the 20th century, we're sort of stuck with the definition of the welfare state that is centered around one family breadwinner, usually male, and around this you have certain labor rights, pension regimes, sickness leave, maternity leave, and things like that. I was just wondering whether there was not, isn't there the alternative on debates on social and economic rights, just as a sheer entitlement, food security, health insurance as a general right that is not tied to your labor contract, that's not existent? Or is it that you just, at the moment narrating the story as it evolved? Yeah? I mean, is there no parallel narrative that we could look towards too? Especially from today's perspective, where the welfare debate has so much shifted to the social economic rights debate. Another point I wanted to raise is the question of design, right? All of this sounds so logical and so step by step, but is there actually something like constitutional design, right? I mean, or don't we just see coincidences, unintended consequences as a law of history? I think Jefferson said he thinks the US Constitution will last 19 years. Yeah, that was his expectation. Nehru wrote in multiple letters in the 1950s that he thinks the Indian Constitution has to be redone because it was done under such stress, and he thought we should redo it within 10 years. Yeah, so what about these aspects of design and maybe coincidence? Yeah? I don't know, is design sort of a fiction? Is this all really going by plan? And then I had one other big question I had is the role of the emerging OBC politics, which is left to the states in terms of identifying the OBCs and setting OBC policy. So I often think that the absence of the reservation policy in the definition of what is the Indian welfare state. I don't know if you include that in the definition, right? But that seems to be a massive intervention, a social policy intervention, which is not centered around labor, but is centered around categories, which we actually might describe as personal federalism, maybe also.
Of what kind of
personal federalism? Yeah, that we have identities of groups which we don't link to territory or domicile, but which we link to an ethnic identity marker. Same would go for the personal law system, so there's a constitutional value that allows for diversity and different rights regimes. So I'm just looking for competing visions there. And then maybe the last question I had is the role of the federal court, because I think the Indian Supreme Court has been quite a strong actor in terms of centralization of Indian federalism and bringing to the foreground unitary features. Yeah, so, I mean, if you just think about the role of the creamy layer, which is, I think, another aspect which I would take into account when describing the Indian welfare state. Kerala said we don't have a creamy layer in Kerala, the Kerala state government, and then that is imposed by the Indian Supreme Court in a multitude of judgments that Kerala must design and implement a creamy layer policy. So the role of the courts in this, it's just a question whether that played a role as well. But once again, thank you so much. Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating and has really changed the way I look at a lot of my understanding of the emergence of Indian federalism in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question is that pessimistic view of federalism and welfare state. I really would not agree with it. That how could the idea of welfare state go against federalism?
So my question was related to, so you're situating the welfare state and the or the welfare regime and federalism in the late colonial period, and your critical juncture is World War II. So your explanatory variables are very generic across Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, and the larger colonial world. When the explanatory variables are very generic across the colonial world, why is India's federalism or welfare regime so unique? As in, why did it not emerge in similar ways in other colonial contexts? Thank you.
Yeah, I have two questions. Now, one is to do with, I just want to sort of push you a bit more beyond slightly the mid-50s to the time when we sort of have political change in the late 60s, 70s. The Congress is no longer what it is. Nehru is not at the helm of affairs. So in a sense, the welfare state starts to change in terms of what it represents and what it means. So, I mean, in what sense do we then place those changes in the international idea of the welfare state? Because we're talking about the post-Second World War idea of the welfare state, and in some ways, social security was central to it. But then world over, we sort of also shift to this idea of development, and then what does that mean for welfare regimes? And the second question, I mean, if we have time, I think it would be great if you can also reflect on some other parts of your work when you're talking about the informal sector, agrarian labor, and how they sort of fit into this story of federalism. Respond to it, and then we can have another round of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I could probably spend hours responding to these questions, so let me do my best. Alex, you've started with my favourite question, and I didn't even touch on it in this presentation. Why did Ambedkar adopt a model of a welfare state which focused on industrial workers in the formal sector? And so I have to digress now into my favourite anecdote, which got me started on some of this. There was a very interesting moment in all of this during 1944, when Ambedkar issued an invitation that the Viceroy was bitterly opposed to Beveridge to come to India and write a Beveridge report for India. And the Viceroy very reluctantly had to agree to transmit this to Beveridge. Beveridge was very, very keen to come. It turned out that Beveridge had a family history in India. Both his parents had worked here. He'd been born in India. He was casting around for things to do after having finished the Beveridge report. He was just planning a series of tour international lectures, but he was really keen to do something quite substantial in India. And discussions progressed, and Beveridge had, so I spent time looking at Beveridge's private papers, and in his files he's been interviewing potential secretaries who might help him here. Ambedkar's, there's been discussion in India about who might travel to London to brief Ambedkar on all of this. There's a press release prepared. It's all about to go. Beveridge is about to come, and the press release is entitled something like a new Beveridge report for India. And then it all collapses. And it collapses because Beveridge refused to have his focus confined to social security for the industrial workforce. He said, I want to come to India and I want to write a report on freedom from want in its totality. And that would include agricultural productivity and questions that aren't directly related to the kinds of social insurance that we're discussing in Europe. And Ambedkar vetoed that. He said, absolutely not. It's unfortunately the archives don't reveal why Ambedkar was so adamant, and so one can only really surmise. And my kind of twofold surmise is both that there was a pragmatic political question, and if you start to open up the question of social security beyond the industrial workforce, you open up a whole set of other political debates with landed interests. If you start talking about, because there were discussions, especially at the ILO in this period, about social insurance for agricultural workers, but I suspect that was politically even more difficult than forwarding that agenda for industrial workers. And I think the other part of Ambedkar's thinking was likely that cities were the future space of emancipation for scheduled castes, and these initiatives were therefore part of building that new that new kind of vision of an industrial worker in urban India. So I suspect it was a combination of those, and also the kind of momentum that was provided by India's membership of the ILO as well, which drove it down this particular model of employment-linked social insurance, which ironically ends up looking probably more Bismarckian than it does Beveridgean. But I think a kind of fascinating part of the story as to why the formal sector in India develops and is defined in the way that it is. On constitutional design, I take your point, I've pieced together here what seems a coherent thread from things that might actually be quite random. So was there just a drafting error that meant that labour welfare was dropped off the concurrent list? I suspect it wasn't a drafting error because certain parts of labour welfare, like provident funds, were left with the central government and other aspects were left with the provinces. So I think it actually reflects a colonial government that saw particular forms of labour policy as being things they could engage in and others that they didn't want to touch. And there was quite a lot of opposition. I didn't talk about that, but the jute sector and of course the kind of the complexion of the national complexion of the jute industry is very different to cotton textiles. So you have kind of Anglo-Scottish employer voice in Bengal, which was vociferously opposed to some of this, and in many ways plugged much more into the colonial state than Indian-owned textile mills in Bombay. So I think I'm reasonably confident in thinking that there are some aspects here of design, not just random drafting errors, but and coincidences. But I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Really interesting question on reservation policy as well, and this is something which I am actively thinking about. At the moment, in the story I'm telling, I have not included reservations as part of the definition of the welfare regime that I'm looking at. I will need to defend that, and it's not to say that they're not an important part of a welfare regime. And so in the framing of the book, I will obviously need to look at how all of this connects to a debate about reservations. But as you say, when you try to, and the federalism will be a theme in the book, but it's not going to be quite as central to the book as it has been to the talk. But when you think about reservation policy from the perspective of federalism, it does raise interesting questions. So, caste is not, most caste groups are not territorially concentrated in a way that allows group rights to find a territorial expression, and yet things like defining which jatis find their way onto the OBC list is an important prerogative of the states. So it does help to, and of course, some states, especially the linguistic states in the south, are coterminous with the big with major caste jati clusters, at least. So there is a kind of regionalised dimension, especially to OBC politics. But yes, I don't get deep into that here. And I think I'll just take away the points about the Supreme Court there, because I think you're absolutely right in its role in the definition of Indian federalism. The Supreme Court has said some quite surprising things, which seek, in fact, to define Indian federalism as not actually having a significant territorial base at all. It's a dual polity, but not necessarily one that has a territorial foundation. A pessimistic view of the welfare state. It's interesting that you say you don't agree with that, and I can see why, because there are good reasons to challenge it. The reason that much of the literature sees federalism as being an inhospitable context to develop universalistic welfare policies is partly because of the kind of propensity towards these forms of competition, horizontal competition, particularly between mobile capital. So where provinces are competing for capital, there's an incentive for regional governments to create forms of labour regulation that reduce the cost for employers. So that's one of the kind of key reasons why federalism is often seen as an inhibiting structure. But it also divides, it also can make it hard for class-based political mobilisation because interest groups are confined to state or regional level arenas rather than, which makes it harder to organise on a national basis. Same is true for social mobilisation, social movements. So federalism both gives social movements more points of access to the state because there are more governments to influence, but it can make it harder to mobilise at a national level. So you can see very uneven advances, and I think India bears that out. You have some states which are pioneers in terms of social policy. Kerala historically, Tamil Nadu in more recent years, Himachal Pradesh, and even some of states like Chhattisgarh and Orissa in more recent years. So you have real pioneers, but you also have places where social policy is very weakly implemented, and it's hard for the central government to change that equation. Yes, this question on why India and not elsewhere. Partly this is a question of the fact that, at least if we think about partition with India, with Pakistan and then Bangladesh, much of this debate is happening before partition. So and India inherits the kind of approach to labour regulation, which is not then pursued in the same way in Pakistan or Bangladesh. Sri Lanka, of course, and that's something else actually which will be interesting to think through as I frame the book as a whole. Sri Lanka develops a very different and more universalist conception early on of welfare state. And there's some other literature on comparing the colonial effects, the implication of different models of colonialism for social policy. So there's work by Catriona Schmidt and co-authors in recent years, and others who work on sub-Saharan Africa, because there are just more examples of former colonies that have taken quite different routes. And in most of those places, British colonies, didn't adopt similar forms of sickness insurance that you see in India. So India does look fairly unique, both across British colonies, but also in South Asia. But yeah, thank you for the prompt. Lipika, yes. So the kind of next section of the book really picks up this story about how the welfare state changes and how the Indian state and other interest groups start to define what a welfare state might look like in the absence of having cracked the employment problem. So the question of underemployment and unemployment, it's very striking. If you go back, if anyone who's interested in this, if you go back to the third and fourth 5-year plans, the language of despair about unemployment and underemployment resonates in almost identical terms with policy discourse today. You know, even by the second 5-year plan, India's pace of industrialisation and generation of industrial employment is not keeping up with the rate of population growth. And of course that means also that agricultural labour is not moving out of the agricultural sector. So this really comes to a head after the Green Revolution and with the kind of advent of a new form of agrarian capitalism, which not only kind of cracks the question of agricultural productivity in certain regions, but also generates new forms of inequality. And generates an agricultural surplus. So the kind of part 2 of the book looks at that moment in the history of kind of Indian capitalism. So the book is loosely kind of hinged around these 3 moments of capitalist development: the kind of the emergence of the industrial workforce, then the emergence of a different kind of agricultural workforce and new forms of agrarian inequality, and then the kind of a story post liberalisation, when the rights of informal sector workers come into kind of sharper relief. And you know, you ask how that sits within international debates when the idea, you know, the kind of thinking about the welfare state elsewhere also starts to shift as well and move beyond the idea of a kind of a welfare state that hinges on rights that derive from employment for all sorts of reasons. And of course, for India and other developing countries, starts to be influenced much more by what is happening within the kind of sphere of development agencies and international development. And to my mind, that's why we still lack a kind of unified understanding of what Indian social policy looks like, because social policy then becomes subsumed in a different set of debates about development. So part of what I try to do in the second bit of the book is to recover some of that and think about what its relevance is for looking at how the state regulates the markets in order to kind of protect against contingencies of increased reliance on markets. So that doesn't really directly answer what you're saying, except to say that I'm thinking about it for part 2. So.
Thank you, I really enjoyed that. So my question is, it's actually typological. Like if we have, as you pointed out many times, we have very thick accounts of how these welfare states are formed in Europe and much less written in India, right? So if you use this talk, what kind of definition would you get of the Indian welfare state? If you to name like a few defining characteristics. And to relate it to the question about Ambedkar, if it is in fact the formal, if one of its characteristics is its focus on formal employment, does the word welfare state, is it useful to theorize what we have in India? Because you could say one history of the welfare state is based on universal claims of citizenship. And this is so obviously partial. Does the language of the welfare state cloud something when we're...
I suppose it ties and takes off from Puga's lesson and also relates to your beverage anecdote. So why was it that Ambedkar was resistant? Is the question. Because Ambedkar surely was one voice on workers' rights from the Indian social might have moved in a different direction. Why do you think that might have been that we, from your account, it seems as though that position taken then tracked. Why was it that it remained like that? Is the question that I'm asking.
Well, two questions in a way. Well, two questions in a footnote, just because I happen to read. See you bear on this. I mean, the first thing was that, really at the time of independence, the centrifugal political tendencies were very strong, right? Kashmir wanted to go, more or less, probably go, and Pondicherry didn't. Hyderabad wanted to go, right? And there's still a major problem with the Northeast. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on what the political dynamics were. I mean, federalism is obviously a fragile creature, right? Because it can easily fuel, separatist tendencies, as it has done to some extent in the Northeast, particularly to this day. So the politics of this. The other thing was the point you, in a way, just mentioned on this last slide about regional inequality. I mean, I was looking at figures recently, and the usual indicators, poverty, literacy, and so on, with the vast differences, say, between Kerala and Bihar, for example. Okay, the capacity of individual states to, in fact, fund a welfare system, insofar as anything systematically of that kind really exists, right, outside the informal sector. To what extent does that still bear on again, the centrifugal and centralizing tendencies, particularly under the current government? The little footnote was just something I just happened to be reading a book last week about Gandhi's caddy. Okay, and the whole caddy campaign going on, he was pushing this in the 1930s, and all sorts of people, including Ambedkar and Tagore and Nehru, thought this spinning thing was pretty stupid. Actually, it was not going to lead to anything much except independence. But Gandhi's argument seemed to be, in fact, in a sense, a different concept of welfare. I mean, the whole village welfare, what was the phrase he used? I mean, the thing that, Kumarappa set up and all this kind of stuff, right? Had to do, in fact, with an attempt to bypass this formal, institutional, as I understand it, application of ideas of welfare to the bulk of the population, which wasn't going to reach them in the countryside anyway, and provide a kind of alternative. I mean, whether that worked in any way is another question, but I thought that was an interesting reflection on the very period that you were just talking about a few minutes ago.
I think we should take 3 questions in one round.
Yes, let me tackle these if that's all right. Purva, thank you, and hello. I probably used the expression welfare state too much in this talk, actually, because I quite carefully try to avoid using it. So I think there's quite good reason not to define India as having a welfare state, either at the point I'm talking about or today. And that is partly a story which applies to all kind of developing countries, that it's very difficult to think of state-led regulation of the market in a way that the classic definitions of welfare state in Europe, the kind of Esping-Andersen kind of model of welfare capitalism assumes. So in an economy where you have much larger levels of informality, it necessarily produces a different kind of welfare regime. I would talk in the book more about thinking about the Indian welfare regime rather than trying to kind of add an Indian welfare state to existing typologies. And if I were to define it, in some ways it's a recognisable beast. It has a kind of heavy emphasis historically on formal sector employment, and we see that, for instance, in many countries in Latin America. And layered on top of that, a different set of entitlements, some legally protected, for different categories of citizens and workers. But one of the things and one of the big challenges we're trying to bring this book together is really that question of what does this all add up to, especially in a kind of context where India is both surprisingly audacious in some ways. So to go back to the kind of why India and nowhere else, India's doing things in 1948 which look quite surprising in kind of by international comparison, and yet at the same time it has, you know, perilously low levels of social expenditure on key sectors of you know, especially education and health today, and has been a definite laggard in terms of increasing expenditure on forms of non-employment linked social assistance for other categories of workers. So in the kind of overall, you know, structure of a welfare regime, it bears similarities to other places, but there are definitely peculiarities, things that India has done, things that it hasn't. Another story in the book is why India has gone in historically so heavily for rural public work schemes, rather than alternative models that we see in many other countries. And I think that's linked into the particular kind of agrarian capitalism that emerges after the Green Revolution. But also India has, you know, across time been very resistant to the idea of doles and handouts and that, you know, that kind of language you see throughout this period. Then there was the question on Ambedkar and why was Ambedkar resistant, but also what were others saying, and that's also really important. So, and I perhaps have falsely created the sense that what happens in this moment then goes on to shape the approach to thinking about a welfare state in the decades after independence. In fact, things changed quite quickly, especially by the mid-1950s and Congress's new definition of what a socialist pattern of society might look like, and especially around the time of the second five-year plan. And they downplay this kind of Ambedkarite, Bismarckian model of social insurance for the formal sector. And in fact, in important ways, the path of industrialisation that's adopted for then forecloses the idea that you would expand the formal sector because of the protection that's given to small-scale cottage industries and the, you know, public investment in the kind of lower employing capital goods sectors of the economy. So, you know, there are important reasons why this kind of Bismarckian model of social insurance actually doesn't expand massively after it's introduced. It expands in the sense that there's a really interesting story of how it is implemented across the country, but it doesn't expand to cover a larger proportion of the workforce. And in fact, you know, the discourse around the welfare state really starts to shift more. You know, I mean, there is much more concerned about land reforms and community participation in development. All those ideas start to infuse what a welfare state might look like, rather than what happens to industrial workers. John, on kind of the other political dynamics that are going on at the same time and kind of centrifugalism. I mean, this is the kind of, you know, the I suppose the classic story and that is told about the kind of how federalism is shaped after partition in order to prevent those centrifugal tendencies undermining the very, you know, idea of an Indian nation. And so, you know, Nehru's resistance to the creation of linguistic states, for instance, was bound initially, after independence, was very much bound up in trying to kind of keep a lid on those centrifugal tendencies. In fact, what happens is that the centre has to negotiate and accommodate some of these regional assertions, and in that accommodation finds a happier balance between central and local power. But yes, I mean, I certainly take your point. This was a mammoth process of political integration that was going on. At the same point that this rupture of partition was taking place as well. And Gandhi, the point on Gandhi, yes, absolutely. I mean, Gandhi is another person who has a quite different conception of welfare, of trade unionism, of what workers' and employers' rights might look like. So I shouldn't. I mean, Ambedkar is privileged in the account I tell here because he's important at a certain juncture for a certain kind of welfare policy. But there were certainly very different ideas at play. And then the question on regional inequality and do individual states have the capacity to fund their own welfare systems? It's right at the heart of the debate that's going to play out in a few weeks' time when the report of the next Finance Commission is published. Because there is a massive centre-state battle over who should have the fiscal space to expand welfare provision. This government would very like more fiscal space of its own to do that. But the story in the last, since the early 1990s, has been the increasing role of the states in social expenditure. And this Finance Commission has essentially been asked to adjudicate on that very matter. Since the takeoff of economic growth, more states have had more capacity to invest more of their own resources in social policy. Some of them have chosen to do that. Other states, however, remain heavily dependent on fiscal transfers, especially the smaller northeastern states and so on, which have a very large proportion of their budget taken up by federal transfers. Yeah.
I'd say a follow-up. I'm hearing your reply after I have one more follow-up, which is that if the policy dated post-independence changed drastically from that, kind of way you're touting that for inequalities, then in which case, what implications did that have for the federal model that developed or was imagined in that period? I was wondering what the connections were there.
Yeah.
I'm not quite able to frame that question satisfactorily, but I was wondering if you could speak to that. At a more general level, anecdotally, I was thinking of, forces of centralization that, again, just a matter of clarification. Were you suggesting that the approach to labor had a bearing on the form of federalism that India adopted? In which case, how does one think of other forms of urges to centralization? Like, for instance, just interesting examples like the freight equalization. It's just attempt to extract resources, which actually led to regional disparity rather than regional uniformity. So I was wondering how you think about that.
Same question.
It doesn't connect, but it's a short question.
Yeah.
Can you ask it now? Yeah. So you've already mentioned the linguistic states. It's perfectly possible to tell the story of the linguistic states without ever mentioning the Soviet Union, right? But if you tell it to a Russian scholar or to somebody with knowledge of the Soviet constitution, they will immediately adopt a comparative framework. And I think today we often forget sort of the central role that Soviet ideas and constitutional models and policy realities might have played in that timeline. So I was just wondering, if I have to imagine the ILO in the 1920s or 30s, or if I have to imagine a debate in the Provisional Parliament and the Constituent Assembly, and you have a Communist Party representative, to what extent there is this big other set of ideas, that we might sort of put up in the bracket of the Soviet Union. That might be quite crucial for that story.
Should I take this? Yeah. Thank you, and more really interesting questions. So what implications did the kind of shift in the vision for the welfare state affect federalism? So if the mid 1940s were about the welfare state and for industrial workers, the mid to late 90s, one of the big arguments for why land reforms didn't take place as successfully as Nehru might have liked was the mobilisation of landed interests at the state level. And of course, land was a state subject, not a federal subject. So there is a really important federal dimension as well when you come to think about that landscape of social and economic policy and what the central government could do in the 1950s. And on the kind of other kinds of policy, like freight equalisation, I actually think I haven't looked into the history of freight equalisation, but I actually think it was animated by quite a similar spirit to some of what I've been talking about, in that it was an attempt to try and promote, it didn't work out in that way, but it was an attempt to try and promote more uniform development by not giving a special privilege to places that produce minerals, but enabling the kind of those natural resources to be used to develop industry across India, based on the kind of effective allocation of industrial licenses by the central government. So of course we know that that wasn't the story that played out, but I think the kind of inspiration for it may lie in kind of similar conceptions about how do you promote national uniformity in economic development. And Alex, it's a really interesting question on the role of Soviet ideas in this period. And of course, the Soviet and former Soviet countries provide yet another model of what a welfare state looked like. So earlier I talked about the Esping-Andersen model of welfare capitalism, but in the Soviet bloc, you have a very different kind of approach to a management of a controlled economy, and a quite universal conception of the state's role in underpinning or providing social provisioning within that command economy. And so, India's mixed model in the mid-1950s, speaks to both of these emerging models of welfarism. I haven't detected a very, strong residue of ideas coming from the Soviet Union directly, but maybe there may well be residues that I haven't picked up, and in fact, I haven't probably done enough to trace, for instance, the position of the CPI on these debates across time as yet. But I will make another note to self.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, and also all of you for being here today. Just to brief some of the observations and some of the insights that I have is what is fascinating about the stream of welfare literature is also the role of much trade union leaders like Nimbalkar in kind of negotiating and lobbying with the colonial government to expand socio-economic rights. And what is interesting for me is the diffusion of ideas from Beveridge Plan and the Second World War amongst the elites in India, and trying to kind of develop some kind of alliance with the trade unions to kind of expand welfare state. But also what some of these ideas, we also see that the lack of industrial base is evident in the class structure in India as well, because India, as compared to even countries like Brazil or countries in Latin America or in Africa, does not have the same level of mature middle class which these countries have now. So I think, there are continuities with the historical realities, and also what remains fascinating to me is also how natural resources possibly played an important role in concentration of development, and also the kind of colonial rules along with the local princely states. Like I think in the case of Kerala, it's evident that the princely states have played a very pivotal role in structuring welfare state along with the missionaries, and how these different agencies and organizations have played a very important role alongside the development of welfare states across India. And yes, and I think in your other written work, you do look at state capacity, fiscal capacity of states, and why there is so much disparity as well. And also, I was I also was wondering, maybe at some point in my own work, I look at, is there any kind of resonance with Mackenzie-Ville's work in African countries where there are some cash reserve countries and labor reserve colonial economies, and the welfare structures have been inherited from there. So I was wondering that do the agrarian agricultural development or sectoral development in India has some kind of can we really understand welfare from those perspectives as well, that the patterns of agricultural development may have also influenced the kind of welfare states that eventually developed across India as well. But these are very deep questions, and it does require a lot of archival research, and the in-depth work you've presented is fascinating and also very inspiring for us to continue doing more research in this field and find out more about it. And I hope you'll visit us again in our campus and to a more wider audience as well, and meet our other students as well. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Oh yeah, we have, so this is our Jindal culture, important part of our ancient customs, our 10-year-old ancient customs. John, can you do the honor?
Oh, right, because I'm the most ancient person here, right?
No, I think you're very young in your heart.
Of course.
And this
We'd
is
like to thank you with a little gift with the university scarf, which has the colours of the original schools. Because in London you will find it quite useful. It's warm.
And increasingly in Delhi.
If you still write anything by hand, we would like to present you with a pen, which you may inscribe things, memories of Jindal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And congratulations for your 10-year anniversary as well, I should say.
And we have some tea and snacks in the mess, so we can proceed there and continue our discussion. Yeah. We need a group photograph as well. That's our. We need to kind of. We're very organized.
You want to do that here, or
We can do it here.
yeah?
Is there a,
Shall I turn this off, maybe?
yes. Yeah.
Not sure how that. I'm not sure how that turns off. Oh, okay, thanks. There's nothing obvious that controls it. But...
I think we just pull this out.
There's a switch over there. I can switch it off.
Ah, okay.
And just pull this off.
You've done it.
Oh, okay, great.
We almost met last year. We were supposed to present at Milan Vaishnav's in Washington DC.
Yes, yeah. You were there, were you?
I filled in for you.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was a grad student at that point, and I was looking for some opportunity to present.